Greetings, sisters and brothers, comrades. Welcome to African History Club, episode number 26. I'm your host, Milton Alimadi. I welcome patrons that have just joined us since the last podcast. You may have noticed in recent weeks, I've been trying to mix it up and focus on some contemporary issues as well. I looked at Uganda recently, the sham so-called elections in Uganda. I did a segment on Tigray, the conflict in the Tigray region in Ethiopia. So going forward, I think I'll keep up that kind of mix. I'll look at contemporary issues, contemporary challenges, but also I'll go back to the historical aspect as well. Because obviously, by looking at the historical challenges, we can look at the legacy of some of those challenges that still present themselves in contemporary Africa today, in the 21st century. So today, I want to look at Oginga Odinga, who I believe is not given enough recognition in terms of the pioneer resistors, people that struggled for African independence. And Odinga, of course, was a Kenyan nationalist and was at the forefront of the fight for Kenya's independence in the 1940s and 1950s, leading to Kenya's independence from Britain in 1963. Now, he wrote a book. I think it was published in 1967. And the title of the book is Not Yet Uhuru. And Oginga is spelled Oginga, and the last name is Odinga, Odinga. And interestingly enough, he and Jomo Kenyatta, who became Kenya's first president, had not really a falling out, as people like saying. It was never a falling out. They were just ideologically incompatible. Odinga was a socialist. Kenyatta basically embraced neoliberalism. He embraced allowing Kenya to become the epicenter of British and American capital concentration after Kenya's independence. So both of them could not survive at the same time. So initially, when Kenya became independent, Odinga was Minister of Home Affairs, and then shortly later actually became Vice President under Jomo Kenyatta. But his book is called, as I said, Not Yet Uhuru. I highly recommend it. And I'm going to read a little bit segments from the book as we continue with our podcast. Basically, the way to see it is that not only in Kenya, of course, but in Africa, there were two views of what independence would mean. Some Africans were looking forward to inheriting the states. They would now be the beneficiaries. They would become the new elite, and all the rewards of running the state would accrue to them. And of course, if you remember one of my recent podcasts, when I focused on Steve Biko warned that in his country, South Africa, Biko, of course, was brutally murdered by the apartheid regime in 1977. But Biko warned that in South Africa, if we just replace the white apartheid regime with African rulers, and that's it, then there would be no transformation in the system. It would just be basically changing the complexion or the color of the people that are running the enterprise. So that is one view of seeing Africa. People like Biko, people like Odinga wanted to transform society. Because you think about it, in the 1960s, as African countries convert toward independence, they're trying to repudiate colonialism. And colonialism, in their minds, was epitomized by capitalism. European colonialism equals capitalism equals discrimination, exploitation, and all the torment that they had endured during colonial rule. So that is why many of the African leaders who repudiated colonialism embraced socialism, or what they called African socialism, in the case of Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, for example. And by this, he meant that the country did not have to go through the entire process of dialectical materialism, contradictions, and each state advancing to a higher stage of social, economic, and political arrangement. Basically, he said we can use the foundation of our historically communal society to build our brand of socialism from that foundation. That is how Nyerere in Tanzania explained it. And in the case of Kwame Nkrumah or Sekou Touré, I don't think that they presented as a coherent and outline as Nyerere did in terms of what he meant by African socialism. But to most of those other ones, it meant a repudiation of the system that had been imposed during the colonial era. So they saw socialism as the alternative. They took inspiration from the ones whose country became independent later on, took inspiration from leaders like Nehru in India. India had won its independence a little earlier. They took inspiration from Abdel Nasser in Egypt. So that was the setting in Kenya as Kenya led toward independence. But in order to understand that the divergent paths or visions of Kenya that Odinga had and Jomo Kenyatta had, we have to understand how Kenya differed or was different from the other two countries in East Africa, which were Uganda, and during the colonial era, it was Tanganyika, which later on became Tanzania, of course, when it united with the island of Zanzibar in 1964. Kenya was unique in that it had a huge settlement of Europeans, unlike Uganda and unlike Tanganyika/Tanzania. And in Kenya, these Europeans, during the colonial era beginning in the 1890s, seized 4 million acres of the most prime real estate, the most fertile agricultural land, and displaced Africans from their land, primarily the Kikuyu. And we went over some of this aspect in an earlier podcast, but I just wanted to sum it up a little. So the 4 million acres given to 1,000 European families, basically a penny, a penny per acre. So some Europeans ended up owning 300,000 acres. The Kenyans who were displaced were now forced to become laborers on these huge plantations owned by the Europeans that had displaced them through massacres, ethnic cleansing, and that is why I'm very hesitant to refer to them as settlers. And I think I mentioned this in an earlier podcast as well. I don't think it's right to refer to somebody as a settler, somebody who comes and kills and takes over one's land with no provocation, no history of any conflict between the two parties, and then forces them to become laborers on land that actually belonged to them. And how did they accomplish this? They introduced a tax system where the Africans had to pay tax. They called it a head tax, so it's per person tax, and they called it a hut tax, the taxation on their homes as well. And this tax had to be paid with currency minted by the British colonials. And the penalty was physical, corporal punishment, or imprisonment for people that did not pay the taxes. So that is how the labor pool was forcefully created in Kenya. So obviously, it generated a lot of resentment. And ultimately, unlike in Uganda or Tanzania, where the independence was more like peaceful mass resistance, defiance and disobedience campaigns that forced the British to ultimately negotiate the terms of independence. In Kenya, the Africans actually had to bear arms, and they fought a war to try to recover their land. And in Kenya, the movement was called the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. Now, they were demonized as Mao Mao, M-A-U-M-A-U, and nobody even know what Mao Mao means. I guess the term was probably concocted by some British public relations professionals. It just sounds very menacing. Ooh, Mao Mao in Africa. So they were alleged to have been inspired by African witchcraft, and at the same time, supposedly inspired by communism at the same time. Obviously, this is a period of the Cold War contest, so any African who was resisting colonialism was automatically labeled as must be a communist. Otherwise, why would you want to resist and fight against the benefits of colonial exploitation? And so while this war was carried out in the Kikuyu region in Kenya, the British imposed a state of emergency in 1952, and that gave the British really license to launch a scorched earth operation, dropping bombs on the areas where these guerrilla fighters were concentrated, and in fact offering bounties to these British European soldiers who were brought to Kenya to fight this resistance, offering them bounty for every head of African resistance fighter that was presented. There's an interesting documentary that goes through some of this, and I will post that also at the end of our podcast today. So the Mao Mao, as the British called them, were referred to as terrorists. Obviously, they referred to themselves as Kenya Land and Freedom Liberation Fighters. The British, on the other hand, were not referred to as terrorists, even though most of the acts of terrorism were committed by the British and the Kenyans who served under the British military command during that fight of for Kenya's independence. Ultimately, an estimated 30,000 to 200,000 Africans were killed during this resistance. Only 32 Europeans were killed. Africans were confined in concentration camps the British euphemistically referred to as protected villages. The British have a long history with these concentration camps. In South Africa, at the turn of the 20th century, the British fought two wars with the Dutch, who had also been contesting there for land and minerals. So you had the British and the Dutch fighting over a country and a land that did not belong to them. And the British, they were referred to as the Boer Wars, B-O-E-R, though that was how the Dutch were referred to in South Africa. After the British defeated the Dutch in the Second War, the British had placed many of them, during the war itself actually, in concentration camps, and up to 27,000 died, mostly women and children. So the British had good experience in terms of how to use these concentration camps by the time the Kenya Land and Freedom Army started fighting the War of Liberation in Kenya in 1951-52. So much of the fighting lasted until around 1957-58. Ultimately, the leader of the guerrillas, Dedan Kimathi, D-E-D-A-N, Kimathi is K-I-M-A-T-H-I, was captured and given a kangaroo trial and executed in 1957. So if you do a search, you'll see a very iconic photograph of an African with locks, with folded arms in handcuffs on a stretcher. And that was when he was being displayed to all these European journalists and just the European population in Kenya at that time as well. So as that war was continuing, there was also another parallel form of struggle. And this was carried out by people like Odinga and people like Jomo Kenyatta. They had a political party called the Kenya African Union. Later, after heading to independence, it was transformed into the Kenya African National Union when it combined with another party. But Kenyatta, the British alleged, was the mastermind of the resistance fighters, the guerrillas, and he was given he was railroaded, basically. The judge was paid. One of the key witnesses was paid and offered a scholarship to testify against Kenyatta. And all the evidence was basically concocted. Kenyatta had nothing to do in terms of being involved with the guerrilla fighters. I mean, just his presence as a leading politician who was agitating for independence, that possibly provided the guerrilla fighters with inspiration, but he was not actually tied to them. And Kenyatta was ultimately tried with 5 other Kenyans. The place where it was a remote town called Kapenguria, where the trial took place, and they were, of course, convicted because that's what the British colonial regime wanted. The European population in Kenya had become quite hysterical and just wanted somebody to pay the price. So Kenyatta was convicted. So while Kenyatta was imprisoned, people like Odinga were the ones who were really leading the resistance against colonial rule. And ultimately, Kenyatta was released in 1961, and Kenya won its independence in 1963. So now you have the new state of Kenya. How is Kenya going to move forward in terms of the socio-political arrangement that follows independence? Odinga had become quite prominent during that period when Kenyatta was incarcerated. He was known internationally, he was known globally. And when Kenya won its independence, he became initially the Minister of Home Affairs. And he traveled to the United Nations in 1963 to address the General Assembly of the United Nations. And while he was here, the State Department took him to Atlanta, Georgia. And the State Department wanted to demonstrate that things were improving in the United States, in the South, because Odinga had also been condemning U.S. racism and discrimination toward African descendants here in the United States, African Americans. So the U.S. wanted to do a public relations show by taking Odinga to Atlanta. And interestingly, while he was there, they avoided to take him to the office of to SNCC's office in Atlanta. But the executive director, Jim Foreman, was very enterprising, and he managed to get in touch with Odinga, and they arranged a meeting. And of course, Odinga briefed him and other SNCC leaders on the liberation struggle in Africa, Pan-Africanism, the vision for African unity. And on the other hand, Odinga also got to hear about the struggle for racial equality and justice here in the United States and the civil rights movement. And SNCC had a SNCC singing group as well, and they composed music, a song called Oginga Odinga, and they sang that song for him in 1963. And interestingly enough, some of those singers are still alive, and recently they posted a modern rendition of that song. So if you go to YouTube and you put Oginga Odinga song, you'll see these elderly brothers recalling that era and singing that song. So then, of course, Odinga goes back to Kenya. Kenya becomes a republic. Instead of being a prime minister, Kenyatta is now president, and Odinga becomes his vice president. But it was something that would not be able to be worked out in the long run. Kenya had been the jewel of British imperialism in East Africa. Obviously, the British wanted to retain all these benefits, wanted Kenya to continue being the epicenter of corporations. And by this time, the United States is also becoming much more involved in Africa. And Odinga represented a threat. He reminded the West of people like Patrice Lumumba, who had been murdered by the West and the local African agents in the Congo in 1961. And of course, a few years later, Kwame Nkrumah, who also had a vision not only of socialism, but a Pan-African vision that Africa must unite and become one United States of Africa in order to protect Africa's resources from the rapacious West. And he, of course, was overthrown. So that is how Odinga was also seen as a threat in Kenya. So when he started complaining to his colleagues in government, mind you, he's still in the same government with Jomo Kenyatta, that this is not really what we signed up for. He's complaining that these new African elite are basically not interested in transforming society, and they just want the benefits of having kicked out the European elite, and now that they get to personally enjoy some of these benefits. And let me read a quick segment here from his book, Not Yet Uhuru. And Uhuru, by the way, as I said earlier, is the Kiswahili word for independence or freedom. Quote, "Our independence struggle was not meant to enrich a minority. It was to cast off the yoke of colonialism and poverty. It is not a question of individuals enriching themselves, but of achieving national effort to fight poverty in the country as a whole." So this is from his book, Not Yet Uhuru. And I'll also read from another part. But first, let me tell you what happened ultimately. Of course, when somebody has this vision and he starts articulating it, but most of his colleagues in government just want to become wealthy, it's going to be very difficult for this arrangement to survive. So ultimately, Kenyatta started marginalizing Odinga's role. He would be frozen out of key cabinet meetings where important decisions were being made. So ultimately, Odinga resigned from the government. And in his resignation letter, he said, "I don't feel it's right for me to be paid a salary to do nothing in a country, especially a poor country like Kenya. I can't live with myself for doing something like that." This was a man of highly principled individual. Many African leaders would not do something like that. He's getting paid. He's a part of the government. He could become part of the elite if he wanted to enrich himself. But obviously, he was a dedicated Pan-African nationalist and had a vision for Kenya, which unfortunately was not shared by much of the elite. So eventually he forms his own party called the Kenya People's Union, KPU. And to him, the issue of the land was very critical because he was tormented by seeing that even after independence, the European elite still owned much of the land that they had seized. And there was no serious effort to have ordinary Africans benefit from land redistribution or land reform. So he outlines 6 key points for his party. And number 1, of course, is distribution of free land to the neediest, including squatters and those who lost their lands in the struggle for independence, either by expropriation or through land consolidation. I won't read everything under each point, but I'll just read the beginning of each of the points. Point number 2, settlers who are not citizens cannot be allowed to continue in ownership of vast areas of land with high potential. Number 3, cooperative farming on land taken over from European settlers will be preferred and encouraged in line with the socialist measures to restrict ownership of such land to Kenyan citizens. Number 4, the KPU will fight for a reduction in the size of farms held by individuals. It believes that this is an absolutely necessary measure. In this way, more land will be made available to the wananchi. Wananchi is another Kiswahili word and basically just means the ordinary citizens or the working class. Number 5, once all farms are reduced to a size consistent with democracy and socialism, all individual owners will be given maximum assistance to develop their holding. Number 6, land consolidation will be promoted, but only in a democratic manner, according to the wishes of the people in particular areas. All right, so the land issue was very big for Odinga. And the land issue, of course, was very big to the European elite, who until recently was the ruling class and remained really the economic ruling class. So very similar to what we have in South Africa today, where official apartheid ended in 1994 when Mandela became the first African president, South African, the first black president. But we are now in the 21st century, the year 2021, and in South Africa, of course, the European elite still controlled the economic levers of power. And in Kenya, it remained very similar to that. The Europeans and the new African ruling class. Ultimately, KPU, Odinga's party, was banned, was forced to disband, and then it was banned in Kenya. Odinga himself was arrested and detained for about a year and a half when him and Kenyatta had a very public verbal exchange of abusive language in public during a public event. So the two definitely, from being very close allies during the independence struggle, post-independence, they had very different visions and very different expectations of what independence meant. And they parted ways. And Odinga ultimately was marginalized. He never regained the political stature that he had because as he was seen as a threat to capital in Kenya, he was seen as a threat by the West. He had a vision, a Pan-African vision. Had Odinga actually been president of Kenya, East Africa might have ended up being federated at some point because both Milton Obote was president of Uganda and Julius Nyerere in Tanzania. Both were socialists and both wanted a vision of a united East African federation. But on the other hand, Kenyatta had been firmly in the Western camp and firmly a host of Western capital in Kenya. So that's ultimately why it was difficult to federate East Africa, which would have been a very good signal for the rest of Africa. And then in 1971, of course, the British and Israel helped overthrow Obote, and Idi Amin was imposed in power, and that was the end of any prospects for East African federation and unity. Odinga lived till the ripe old age of 82, and he died in 1994. And as I said, today his son, Raila Odinga, works closely with Jomo Kenyatta, Uhuru Kenyatta, the son of Jomo Kenyatta. And Walter Rodney said something very interesting of Jomo Kenyatta. He said people like Jomo Kenyatta were the ones who shouted the loudest that I'm a Pan-African, I'm a Pan-African. While at the same time, they were seizing huge tracts of land. And today, in the 21st century, in fact, the Kenyatta family is perhaps the largest individual land owner in Kenya. So that's part of the challenge that occurred in Kenya. But this was also duplicated in many African countries. I give you examples of the Africans who were either eliminated like Lumumba or overthrown like Kwame Nkrumah. Africans that had a vision of socialism and wanted to unite Africa into a United States of Africa. Had we had more people like Odinga who had ended up being in power in African countries, and had they followed the vision of Kwame Nkrumah, and had Africa been a United States of Africa today, many of the challenges and issues of protecting sovereignty, protecting Africa's resources, and using Africa's resources to benefit Africans would not be facing those challenges today, more than 60 years after formal end of colonial rule in Africa. So the book that I recommend is Not Yet Uhuru by Oginga Odinga. Oginga is Oginga, Odinga Odinga. Another book I recommend is From Kingston to Kenya by Dudley Thompson. He was a Jamaican Pan-Africanist, and he went to Kenya, and he went to Tanzania, in fact, as well, and became very close friends with Julius Nyerere. And he actually also was involved, because he became a lawyer, he was involved in the defense of Jomo Kenyatta during the Kapenguria trial, for which he was ultimately, Kenyatta was wrongfully convicted. So that is the end of episode number 26. I've been looking at a lot of documents from the State Department, and in a future episode, I want to look at the U.S. behind the scenes support for the apartheid regime in South Africa. So that's going to be one of the future podcasts as well. Thank you so much, sisters and brothers, comrades. Be strong, be safe, remain Pan-African, and let other people know about this podcast. Thank you.